Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual Blake's Breakfast Speaking Series. The theme this year or this session is Navigating Life Sciences M&A, Thought Leader Insights. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining this event today from within the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I would also like to acknowledge that others are joining us from other traditional and unceded Indigenous territories across this beautiful country and beyond. Life Sciences BC is a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization funded through membership and the generous contributions of our sponsors and partners. Our members include academic and research institutions, local and global companies operating in the life sciences space, such as digital and virtual health companies, medtech, devices, diagnostics, biotech, therapeutics, and numerous companies that have identified life sciences as a strategic vertical and provide valuable support and services to our broad ecosystem. Of course, those including investors and venture partners. At each event, we like to welcome our newest members. Here's a snapshot of some of our newest members representing various sectors within our sector in British Columbia. We're continually welcoming new members from our province and across the country and internationally. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us if you're interested in joining. Today's event was made possible by the support of our longstanding sponsor, Blake's. The Blake's Breakfast Series is one of the most popular and longstanding events. We thank Joe Garcia, who you're going to see momentarily, and Blake's for their leadership and commitment in bringing the sector together, showcasing innovation, and supporting early-stage companies. The investment by Blake's, and in particular Joe, in LSBC and the life sciences ecosystem is invaluable. We're delighted to be holding today's event virtually so that we can feature speakers from both Vancouver and outside Vancouver and outside of Canada to share their perspectives on this really important and interesting topic of M&A. As we all know, the capital markets have been changing, and we're at a very unique point today where it relates to how capital flows and what's happening in M&A, both from the last couple of years, but as we look ahead. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Joe, who is going to lead this session. Joe is a partner in the securities group at Blake's and helps run the National Life Sciences Group. His practice focuses on corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions. He advises public and private companies, investment dealers, venture capital, and private equity funds, and acts as an independent counsel to board directors. Before his career in law, Joe worked in corporate finance with a national investment bank and in clinical research and with a multinational pharmaceutical company. He's a longtime and passionate supporter of LSBC and our ecosystem. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Wendy, for the kind introduction. And we're very pleased to be here today with an extremely distinguished panel of guests that will speak on a really relevant topic at the moment. So by the way, I'm a partner here in corporate finance and M&A. At Blake's. So in terms of the topic, a number of strategists right now are predicting a surge in healthcare M&A, and dollar-wise, last year was significantly higher than the prior year in terms of dollar value. And the prediction is that as confidence builds, healthcare M&A will potentially significantly increase as well. And there are a number of given drivers for that, such as top-line pressures in multinational pharma or biotech companies, patent cliff related issues, and the need to deliver revenue, which trend will continue. In terms of the panel discussion, we're going to try and focus on 4 areas and give some insights from our panelists on first the M&A market in general. We talk sort of past, present, future, what are some of the trends and drivers of it. The second, we'll explore institutional investor perspectives on who they invest in and how they help to build value within companies that could ultimately potentially exit through M&A. Third, we'll try and touch on the perspective of the acquirer and what they're looking for and internal views on how to have successful M&A and de-risk integration issues, among other things. And then fourth, we'll touch on the actual M&A transaction itself. And we can talk about some of the issues that arise on cross-border M&A. We can talk about in terms of how to work with your advisors, and that's both targets as well as acquirers. Things like bridging value gaps and other interesting insights that the speakers may have on how to complete an M&A transaction in an effective and successful manner. So I'm going to introduce each speaker briefly, and then each will have a moment to provide some thoughts or opening remarks, in particular about their perspective or insight or where they're coming to this topic from, given their experience. And then we'll pivot to the panel discussion and then wrap up at the end. So we've been hosting this breakfast speaking series for about 25 years, and I just really want to quickly thank Wendy and the entire Life Sciences team who works diligently on behalf of the industry to promote its interests and on events such as this, which have played an instrumental role in helping to build the community. So with that, I'm going to introduce Sean McGregor first. Sean is an executive director in JP Morgan's Healthcare Investment Banking Group, based in New York, covering biopharma companies. Sean joined JP Morgan in 2021, having previously spent 6 years in Citi's Global Healthcare Investment Banking Group. Sean previously was an attorney at Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom LLP, and holds his Juris Doctorate from Duke University and an industrial and labor relations degree from Cornell University. With that, welcome, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Look forward to today's discussion. As Joe mentioned, I work at JP Morgan in the Healthcare Investment Banking Group. I cover emerging growth companies, both public and private, as they think about their capital formation needs as well as strategic alternatives. And I also work with large pharma companies as they think about bolstering their pipelines and those opportunities that are available to them in the market. So look forward to today's discussion.
Great. Next is Dr. Alicia Levy. Alicia is a venture partner in Versant's San Francisco office, where she is focused on both investing and new company creation. Alicia has an established track record as a company creator, operator, and deal maker. She was most recently the president and COO of Pioneer Immunotherapeutics and was instrumental in the company's collaboration and partial acquisition by Gilead Sciences and eventual merger with Ikena Oncology. Prior to Pioneer, she served as both a member of the Versant investment team as an operating principal and the business development lead for portfolio companies. Welcome, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's great to be here today. As you mentioned in your introduction, I'm based in our San Francisco office, and I am a venture partner, which means I both look at new deals and am an investing partner, and then also set up new companies based off of technologies that we're really excited about. Really looking forward to discussing the M&A landscape with you all today.
Thanks, Alicia. And with that, I'd like to introduce Siobhan Pomeroy. Siobhan joined Gilead Sciences corporate development team in June 2019 and has held roles of increasing responsibility, including oversight of the company's oncology group. In her current role as VP Corporate Development, Siobhan oversees a team responsible for executing transactions, including M&A, R&D collaborations, licensing, and equity investments across Gilead's core therapeutic areas of virology, oncology, and inflammation. Since joining Gilead, Siobhan has been instrumental in executing a variety of transactions and partnerships, including the acquisitions of Immunomedics and MiroBio, as well as strategic collaborations with Arcus, Dragonfly, and Tentarix. Siobhan spent 4 years at AbbVie, where she focused primarily on oncology opportunities and led negotiations for several transactions, including novel early-stage collaborations with Pure MHC and Genomics Medicine Ireland. Welcome, Siobhan.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. As Joe mentioned, I am part of the corporate development team at Gilead Sciences, and in my current role, oversee our transactions group. So I get involved in a range of transactions, including anything we do on the strategic side. So looking at a variety of M&A, and happy to be here today to share the large biotech perspective.
Thanks, Siobhan. Next, pleased to introduce Nigel Scheel, who is a venture partner based in Basel, Switzerland, with Versant Ventures. He brings exceptional business development capabilities and deep insights with over 2 decades of leadership roles within the pharmaceutical sectors, and is one of the pharma industry's top deal makers. Prior to joining Versant, Nigel was global head of M&A and BD and licensing at Novartis, where he served as a member of the company's senior leadership team. In that role, he was responsible for the execution of a broad range of healthcare deals, spanning research and technology collaborations through to large M&A transactions. Prior to Novartis, Nigel was head of BD and licensing for Bayer Healthcare, and before that served as head of group M&A at Roche and head of licensing for its pharma division. Welcome, Nigel.
Thank you, Joe. It's really a pleasure to be here today. My
Could
role
you,
is...
you're muted a bit. Oh, that's perfect. Thank you.
Should be okay. Is it okay now?
Yes.
Okay, great. No, so it's a pleasure to be here. I'm based in Basel, so it's the end of my day, so it's a bit interesting to have a breakfast meeting at this time. And I have exactly the same role as Alicia, so I won't go through my role at Versant, but maybe I make a couple of comments on, what brought me into the venture community. I joined Versant about a year ago, and I think it's interesting in the context of today's discussion around the M&A markets. And obviously, I joined the venture community at a time when the markets were pretty challenging, and probably remain fairly challenging at the current time. And I think that kind of reflects the move for M&A towards pharma partnerships. And one of the things I'm a great believer in is the combination value of bringing together venture or other capital, biotech entrepreneurship, and large pharma skill sets and kind of weight at the table. So, I think, one of the benefits of the current market is that it forces us all to work together more constructively. And I think that will really drive, what I think will be a very, successful M&A forum over the next couple of years. So happy to talk about that topic today.
Thank you, Nigel. That's great. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Stephen Cohen, one of my partners and colleagues that I work closely with. And I think we're approaching perhaps 24 M&A deals that we've worked on together over the years. Stephen practices securities and corporate law and is based in Vancouver, BC. His practice emphasizes on domestic and cross-border M&A, corporate finance, and corporate governance. He acts for a wide variety of issuers, underwriters, and private equity clients in a variety of sectors, including biotech, high tech, and others. Stephen is a life bencher of the Law Society of British Columbia, and as an adjunct professor has taught classes on public company M&A at both UBC's Allard Hall and UVic Law. Steve is also King's Counsel and is widely recognized for his M&A practice. Thanks for joining us today, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Joe. And as you said, we've worked a lot together on biotech M&A. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, thanks. So with that, we're going to turn to the panel discussion. And we're going to touch first on the M&A market. And I know that 23 approached approximately US 191 billion in deals, although it had about 118 completed. And that was an increase of value over 2022 at about 142 billion, although there were more deals completed in 2022. So with the, with discussing the M&A market overall, I'd welcome your view, Sean, for example, on where we've come from, where we're going, perhaps, what the next year or two may lead to. And then others, please feel free to jump in if you want to discuss some of the drivers. And I had mentioned a couple earlier, but I know there are many others that could lead to significant M&A, at least over the near term.
Yeah, no, happy to start, Joe. So I think first off, I'd say that the biopharma market sentiment has been improving over the last 6 months in particular, while the XBI, which is the index in which we look at as a barometer for the health of biotechnology companies, it underperformed the S&P 500 in 2023, but has rallied recently up 50+% since October. That's due to a more favorable M&A environment and a more favorable outlook in terms of interest rates. I'd say that over the last 12 to 24 months, larger, later stage biotech companies have materially outperformed smaller, earlier stage companies, which, reflects where they are in their stage of development, the relative risk associated with those companies. I think M&A in particular, the fundamentals remain intact, and BD appetite is very high among large pharma and mid caps, as was demonstrated in 2023 and is demonstrated in 2024 thus far. Joe, just in terms of the type of transactions that were done in 2023, there were 23 $1 billion plus deals that were done in 2023, which was an all-time record. The previous high was 15 in 2021. And so momentum has continued with 5+ $1 billion deals thus far being announced in 2024. In terms of some of the tailwinds just we're seeing in the market, it's continued innovation. Novel science and strong data has catalyzed a resurgence of interest, in particular in large prevalence indications such as autoimmune, I&I, and cardiometabolic. In addition to the innovation, upcoming loss of exclusivity for key drugs in the large pharma portfolio has led for an acute need to bolster 2025 plus top-line growth profiles across a number of large pharmas. Yeah. And then lastly, I'd say that large pharma has a lot of balance sheet capacity today. The balance sheets are very healthy, and they have the ability to deploy a lot of capital to the extent they are interested in a strategic asset.
Yeah, I had read recently that there's about US 1.37 trillion available in deal-making capacity. So that's a lot of powder, I guess, that's available to deploy for the right companies or circumstances. I also understood that in 2023, about 69% of the value came from pharma multinationals, which dominated, compared to 38% in 2022, and in part based on a few mega deals, including Seagen at US $43 billion and Merck for Prometheus at greater than US $10 billion. I don't know, any perspectives, Siobhan or Nigel, perhaps on deal size or what companies are looking for, or at least from that perspective, what might drive M&A over the nearest term?
Yeah, I'd be happy to make a couple of comments. I mean, first of all, I'd just like to address the sort of available capital. And, the life sciences industry has never been capital constrained, and pharma companies are not capital constrained. So the limiting factor to getting deals is not actually, availability of cash per se, but it's much more normally constricted by P&L capacity. So, typically the limiting factor in large pharma companies is, their R&D spend, maybe, 21-22% of sales, but at some point there's a kind of cap on the acceptable R&D spend. And that cap is much, it's a much tougher hurdle than the availability of capital. So, which then goes to the type of deals that get done. And what pharma companies are looking for are near-term commercial opportunities. So any deal which is, you know, short-term accretive, if it's sales generating and revenue generating, bottom line generating, you know, that's great, and that would be highly attractive. And what we've seen is there actually aren't many of those opportunities. There's a handful of companies which are really, you know, in the small mid-cap range, which are commercial opportunities. So then, you know, the second level of interest is late stage development opportunities, which are pretty de-risked and, more importantly, don't have a very long P&L burn before they are, you know, going to get to market and start generating revenue. And I think what we saw in 23 was a, you know, kind of feeding frenzy around those kind of opportunities, which are in the kind of low billion range. Which means they're typically in later stage development, but not yet commercial. And, you know, we've seen the pharma industry really, you know, looking intensely in that arena. The interesting thing going forwards is there's less of those companies available, and then you move earlier into the R&D pipeline, earlier stage companies, which by definition have a longer R&D burn. So, you know, it's important to understand with pharma that, you know, the P&L impact is really what they're going to be principally focused on. And they're going to be looking for, you know, P&L accretive opportunities in a reasonable time frame. And so, you know, we're seeing them, you know, start with the late stage opportunities and then move progressively earlier.
Interesting. Siobhan, do you want to share a perspective?
Sure, I agree. I think Nigel made a lot of really great points, and you know, maybe I'll just add a couple of thoughts. You know, I think one, you know, as we look at the environment with LOEs coming up, obviously with the IRA creating, you know, new challenges for pharma companies, I think you are going to see companies continue to be much more acquisitive, and folks are looking for revenue. That's why we saw so many deals, you know, done at the end of last year. I think in general, you are going to find that folks will look for the late stage opportunities, and you know, at least for us at the beginning of the year, and I think this is true for most folks, we're looking ahead to what are those companies that have key upcoming catalysts that could be late stage and very quickly turn to commercial opportunities, or very quickly become de-risked such that we have confidence in them. So, you know, I think you'll continue to see a lot of competition. On average, last year, there was more competition for each deal, and I think that's going to be a theme going into 24 as we look ahead to some of the macro factors that are going to impact pharma and biotechs.
Interesting.
And I think it might be worth adding on the, you know, the patent expiry demand driver, which is very real. You know, we have big classes of drugs which are going off patent, the TNF alphas, the factor 10s, you know, in many areas impacting basically all of the large pharma companies. You know, historically, you know, many companies would have looked at large scale mergers as a potential, you know, path out of those challenges. The current FTC and European antitrust regulatory environment feels a lot more challenging today. And so I think people are looking at an environment where it just may not be so easy to, you know, merge and generate synergy and value through large-scale mergers. And so we're seeing a lot more attention on the mid and smaller sized M&A, and I think we're going to see that continue.
So that's a really good point on the regulatory front that may preclude some of the mega deal type transactions, although there are other risks for integration or different culture, you know, considerations, among other things. So one of the things in terms of trend in the M&A market, like we think about acquisitions, but divestitures also play a role. Like large pharma, my understanding on some, let's call it underperforming or lower growth businesses, are looking to divest themselves of that in order to potentially free up capital or mind space, I guess, for new companies and higher growth opportunities. Are you seeing that as a bit of a trend, or is that just sort of part of the general business model. It's, you know, it just is what it is, let's say, or is that an increasing trend as well? The focus on right sizing the business or making sure you're in the right higher growth areas. Anybody have a view on that, or?
I can comment. I think we're seeing a lot of that. A lot of pharmas kind of shopping around assets, particularly ones that may have come with an acquisition where there was a lead asset that they're kind of holding on to, and then maybe a couple of additional pipeline assets that they've decided to not progress and would like to kind of take the burn off of the balance sheet. And so we've been seeing a lot of that. There are definitely some diamonds in the rough there, especially if you can pivot or reposition some of those assets potentially into another indication. So, you know, we've been seeing that and think that, you know, they could be fodder for new company creation.
Yeah, and some of those acquired companies would have earlier stage assets, which could be, in fact, very interesting. They're just a bit too early stage potentially, and potentially could be taken on by institutional investors, progressed, and then ultimately become a candidate for M&A down the road. Is that something you're seeing, Siobhan, a little bit in the market, where a company really wants a core 60-80% of a company, and then the other areas maybe are a bit too early stage to fit in with the business model and, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it goes back to, you know, Nigel's comments around P&L capacity, right? And also to some of the things you've hinted at in terms of, you know, fitting into a core business and TA areas, right? So, you know, one of the things we're considering, and I think we're seeing this more and more, this came up actually recently with the Sanofi and Hibrix deal, where, you know, folks will pick up an asset or two that they really think is core to the business, and then they'll spin out a new co. And there's various ways in which you can do that. But I think that's going to continue to be a theme. And it's quite frankly, it's something that we talk about a lot as we look at a couple of programs that are highly de-risked, but then there may be other programs that there's a lot more, they require a lot more research and they're just too early. I think the other thing we're hearing from companies, a willingness to divest their lead programs through an acquisition, which is going to be more tax advantaged for them, and then, you know, move forward with a spin out. So it's something we're seeing across the board and consider often also.
Okay, that's great. We have a question that was posed, and just for everyone who is listening, if you do have a question for the panelists, please put it in the chat. So one question just was presented, and it's: how do the panelists assess the current landscape and future prospects of the emerging psychedelic industry, particularly in the context of M&A, given the significant milestone of Lykos Therapeutics submitting their NDA to the FDA for an MDMA-based treatment for PTSD? How do you perceive the pharmaceutical industry's stance on and response to this development? And this is a bit of a charged area because fundamentally it's a product that could be used, you know, for different indications on mental health and whatnot. But as soon as you associate it with psychedelic, it becomes, you know, if it was just a separate, you know, small molecule or whatever being developed for a particular area, whether it's PTSD or otherwise, it perhaps would get less attention than if you put on the psychedelic moniker. Any views on this, or?
I can share one view. I can't really speak to how pharmas are going to think about it, but I think about it in terms of an investment strategy. I think you can bucket these into the group of the therapies that still have the kind of, for lack of a better word, the trip associated with them. And then those that are trying to take the kind of more medicinal part. And some people think the trip is part of the medicinal part, but I'm just saying for sake of discussion, the actual kind of part that's acting on the, you know, on the brain and the neurons to have the pharmaceutical effect. I think there's a difference between those two. So I think that for the therapies that are really kind of more focused on just the pharmaceutical component and not the trip component, so drugs that you could actually take at home without assistive psychotherapy that don't have the abuse potential, I would put those in the category of eventually those are going to be viewed as next generation antidepressants or you know, therapies. The ones that you maybe have to take with a therapist and there is an abuse potential, I think that's going to be in a separate bucket, and that's not something that, you know, we would look at. But the other bucket, I think, where we're just talking about next generation antidepressant therapies, which of course there's an enormous need. I think that is of high interest and will eventually generate acquisition interest.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think we're obviously seeing an evolving disposition with respect to these therapies based on the applicability of these moving forward. I think as we speak with companies in terms of, you know, where they may fit within certain portfolios, the question is on regulatory and social considerations. So, you know, what is, for a large pharma, does this fit in within their strategy? How do they think about, you know, potentially bringing this into their own portfolio? Is this a strategic fit? Is this the right fit? As Nigel was mentioning, given the P&L capacity and the income statement constrained capacity that some of these pharmas may be looking at, is this more attuned to something that they would look to put off their balance sheet and maybe dip their toe in the water through a partnering type strategy, but still they have to overcome some of those social and regulatory considerations internally before they would, you know, pursue something like this.
Perfect. That's great. With that, someone's posed a question to you, Sean, and although we'll touch on elements of this later on getting a deal done on contingent value receipts or bridging value gaps, but the question that was posed is that you had mentioned 20 odd deals, 20 something. I think there were, I'm not sure you mentioned that, I gave a figure, but of the greater than $1 billion deals in 2023, what were the trends of upfronts versus milestones, CVRs? The person has the impression that of the deals that were done, more had back-ended, despite the big top-line press release announced numbers. Do you see, in terms of structuring or trends towards sort of back-end sort of contingent value receipts or ways to deliver value if milestones are achieved, but it's not an all upfront cash payment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would differentiate between public targets and private targets. In public transactions, it's largely going to be upfront payments. There might be some structuring with respect to CVRs that are utilized to the extent there's a narrow gap in value between a potential acquirer and a target. That, you know, it still is utilized in situations where the acquirer is very interested and sees the strategic fit, but there might just be a narrow gap in terms of what is acceptable to the company and board. I'd say in large part, those are all upfront payments that are made to the target shareholders. In private company acquisitions, it is likely more structured in nature. We've seen, you know, significant upfronts being achieved by these private companies with back-end milestones relating to potential clinical development milestones, regulatory approvals, sales-based milestones, and/or royalties. However, you know, as noted, to the extent that the target is in one of these, I guess, popular areas today, such as I&I, cardiometabolic, etc., they may be looking to achieve an upfront that would be similar to what a public company would achieve, or that's how we're guiding private companies, is that if you have the optionality to move forward as a private or a public company, then if someone were to acquire you today, they should be considering it in the context of other public acquisitions that have been done. I'd say that a lot of private companies today, as they evaluate the opportunities of an IPO, are also evaluating a dual track option in which they're having conversations with large pharma. You know, one recent example is Carmot, which is a company focused in obesity and type 2 diabetes that was pursuing an IPO. And the day before they were to launch an IPO, we were able to advise them on the sale to Roche, and that occurred at the end of last year. So it's frequently being utilized by companies as they look to move forward to the capital markets. The more optionality that these companies have to move forward in their clinical development pathway, the better leverage they have in negotiating larger upfronts as a private.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would, you know, what you've seen in the industry over the last couple of decades is, you know, the kind of financial structure difference between licensing and M&A often is not so big in the early stages where there's significant clinical risk. And, you know, you see a lot more, you know, trying to, you know, bridge the risk value gap through the use of milestones. You know, particularly in the private. I mean, obviously in the public, you've got a kind of natural valuation benchmark, which is out there for everybody to see. And, you know, it's kind of interesting, you know, in the markets that we've been through the last few years, when you've seen a kind of 85% fall in value, you know, market value is still market value. And I think, you know, that's where we've seen some, you know, attempt to bridge kind of expectations in a market where you've had a real value dislocation. But, you know, back to the other thing which I find is interesting as a sort of M&A licensing, you know, practitioner, you know, from a contractual point of view, the interesting difference when you have a structured M&A deal is you can't give the asset back because you've bought the company. So in a license deal, you have structured payments, and, you know, so long as you keep making commercial efforts, you keep the asset. Some point you stop, and if you stop, you give the asset back, and then the original owner of the asset can do something with it. The interesting conundrum in the M&A scenario is you've bought the company, so you can't, if you stop, give the asset back. And then you have an interesting discussion around, you know, how do you build confidence into your contractual arrangement that you will actually get the milestones, and that somebody won't, you know, acquire the asset and then kind of change their mind and park it, and you don't get the money, and neither do you get the asset back. So this is always, you know, from a kind of deal construct point of view, an interesting topic when you have a structured M&A deal.
Thank you. One of the things that was discussed earlier, oh, sorry, Steve, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Nigel's point there. Whenever you are dealing with any kind of back-ended compensation in an M&A transaction, it becomes incredibly important to focus on the definitional aspects of it, so you know exactly what you're getting. When you have milestones that you're supposed to achieve in order to get a payout for a CVR, for instance, or when a royalty is payable, certain sales thresholds have to be set, etc. It's incredibly important to make sure you understand exactly what that triggering threshold is and how it's defined in the documents. And even if you have defined it well in the documents, you then have to turn your mind to the effort standard that's in the document, because if the acquirer isn't required to achieve some sort of objective effort standard, instead just has a subjective standard of, you know, trying their best to get something done, well, then you run the real risk of, as Nigel pointed out, of them changing their mind and deciding to go somewhere else with their efforts post-closing. And so if you are relying that as a substantial portion of your compensation to enter into a transaction, it's really important to understand exactly how it's going to get triggered and how it gets paid, because you'll find that when it's being described to you at the LOI stage, it's very glibly say, and when we achieve this milestone, you'll get your money. And then they won't reference the fact that they have no intention of actually putting any effort into achieving that milestone.
Yeah, we've dealt with CVRs, let's call it in concept, many times over the years. And almost always it's thrown out as this great idea to bridge a value gap. And then once you get into the details, everyone appreciates how hard it is to define and to figure out. And almost always it turns out slightly more in cash is paid right up front. And that's how it's typically been dealt with, at least in my experience. And we've had a few, especially, I think one last year where we actually did assist with, and the company did implement contingent value receipts. And there was a lot of discussion around the timelines to achieve, what the metrics were going to be, and trying to hold the acquirer accountable. So it's not an easy fix, let's say, and it's one that's often doesn't actually end up going through in the end, at least in my experience. On one of the things that was talked about earlier, because you did raise the private versus public M&A, and then you have to marry that to large pharma or biotech looking at something that's far enough along the development spectrum and able in the relatively near term to deliver revenue, among other things, revenue growth. Does that principally mean that, or at least what's your experience, that large pharma, large biotech would gravitate more towards the, let's say, public company, larger billion plus deals, 500 million, billion plus deals, and maybe the privates are getting done by earlier stage companies that are trying to put together a number of technologies or a better story to lead to an acquisition down the road? Or do you see large companies buying earlier stage assets in some cases because it really fits into an area that they want to grow or whatnot? Is there a bifurcation or not really? It just, there's no.
I mean, I think it's important to understand that in large pharma companies, you have separate teams of people doing both of those things. You have a corporate M&A group that's looking at mergers and acquisitions and large public acquisitions. You've got BD teams sitting in the therapeutic areas. You've got BD teams sitting in the research organization. And, those BD teams are gold on getting development candidates or IND filings. And so, their objective is to fill the early stage pipeline. So I think these things very much go on independently within large organizations. And, I've run M&A BD teams in, 3 or 4 of the largest pharma companies. And we had separate teams who were dedicated, focusing on, deals at every stage. We had research teams looking at preclinical opportunities. We had clinical teams looking at clinical opportunities. And, as I said, typically, something in the clinic could be in the $1 billion range. If you're getting into the $10-20 billion range, that's a commercial opportunity. And less than 100 million, you're probably in the preclinics. So they're actually, I think very much going on independently. And, pharma is looking aggressively at all stages of the pipeline.
Okay, thank you. And just maybe one more question in this area, and we'll go on to the others that we want to cover. Someone's asked about the role of artificial intelligence and especially generative AI as it relates to life sciences and eventually M&A. Like, does this trend have legs? Like, is it going to lead to within a reasonable amount of time, potentially M&A where large pharma is integrating generative AI teams in particular areas or whatnot? Any views on generative AI or AI and the impact or how to grow companies that could lead to an M&A exit in that area? Like, is there that kind of role or fit within big pharma or large biotech?
I can start in that we work with a number of those companies, and they have a lot of exciting platforms in which they're able to develop novel programs. We've seen largely that those programs are being partnered with, or they're having discovery collaborations with a number of large pharma, in which there's upfront payments and milestones associated with each of the programs that are then progressed. However, have not seen a large number of M&A transactions given the early nature of those programs. I think as platforms are validated, programs are progressed to later stages, we may see more of those. But I think in large part, we've seen large collaborations between those AI drug discovery companies and large pharma.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, there's no doubt AI is super important to the drug discovery activity, and every big pharma company has AI teams, has had for decades, and those are evolving within the company. And it's hard to find a startup company that doesn't have some kind of AI enablement and technology somewhere in their secret sauce. I think the challenge is how do you value that AI and how do you get people to buy it? And that's pretty difficult. And it's pretty difficult because, kind of beauty's in the eye of the beholder. And, most companies have their own AI teams and their own AI approaches. So, how do you demonstrate the value of AI, which inherently is hard to assess. And so, then you end up, okay, the proof of the AI is in the product that comes out, and then you're into licensing and acquisition opportunities, which are essentially, very much like any other product opportunity. And I think there are a couple of, specific challenges for AI, how to make that model work. The first one is clinical failure is the norm. And so if you take a program out of your platform into the clinic and it fails, is that a, invalidation of your platform? Probably not. The platform might be fine. So you've got to be very thoughtful and careful about those initial programs. And, the second thing is, how do you get people to, really value the AI part of the platform and pay money for it, when, there's always a bit of a sense of I can generate my own technology. And even if people like the technology, and we might talk about this later in the discussion, there's a sort of integration problem that people have their own AI platforms, and it isn't always the easiest thing to integrate into your R&D organization. And so there's a sort of a bit of question, this AI platform may work quite well here in this company, but if I try to bring it into my company with the way we work, is it actually going to fit and work in the same way? So I think the integration part is difficult. And then very often that then brings you to people. And a lot of the AI technology rests in, kind of the brains of a few key people. And then you have the, forever M&A problem of, if the team is the secret sauce, how do you keep the team when you bring it into a very different culture and organization?
Maybe if I can just add, Joe, just a couple of things jump out to me too, because I spent some time at Verily, which is basically one of Google's healthcare plays, looking at various initiatives to marry AI with healthcare. One of the things I observed that in early days really was challenging when I was there was that there was not necessarily that happy marriage or easy marriage, if you will, between people that have traditional biopharma skills and R&D discovery, clinical, across that value chain, with the folks that are the real technical experts in terms of the computer science, et cetera. So as folks are thinking about building those organizations, I think it really is key to make sure that you're bringing both parties together. In some respects, you need the biopharma folks to speak the language to your customers, whether it's large pharma or biotech. And of course, you need the technical folks for the underlying technology. I think the other thing that I would add there that really stands out to me is, the industry is looking for practical examples, and that does take time for various reasons. But my guess is I kind of fall into Sean's camp that we're definitely going to see some acquisitions in the future in this space, but it is going to take time for people to appreciate the value. And I think that goes in hand with some of the things Nigel articulated.
Okay, that's perfect. Thanks. So one final thing before we move on to the next topic. Predictions for the next 12 to 18 months. What do you guys think? Is the market going to be bigger than last year, or we can comment on deal value, aggregate deal value, and potentially number of deals. I don't know. Any thoughts before we jump? Anyone want to take this on?
I mean,
go.
I'll let you add, Nigel, but I was going to say,
yeah.
If you look over time, the number of deals has remained pretty consistent. We seem to be hovering between that 35 to 45 number. And my guess is we are going to see a similar amount. It's not going to change that much this year. I do think that folks are willing to move earlier. And, as Sean mentioned, we are seeing companies looking at strategic options as an alternative to accessing the public market. So I think that will certainly lend itself to more M&A too. So my guess is maybe we'll see a little bit more, deal value. Last year was a pretty good year for deal value. We did see increased average deal value. Even if you take, Pfizer Seagen out of there, the average deal was still higher. You know, and my guess is we'll continue to stay on that trajectory, but would love to hear others' thoughts.
Anybody
Yeah,
else?
I mean, I was just going to say, I agree with everything you said. I was just going to say that, you know, when I'm talking to startup companies, I think the important thing is it doesn't matter. You've got to be prepared that it may not be good. And, you know, you can't build yourself around the belief that it's going to be great. If it's great, it's great, and we'll all be happy. But you better have a plan in case it isn't.
Perfect. Anyone else or? Okay.
I was just going to say, I think we'll have a similar number of deals. I think the pace will keep, you know, steady. But I think by the end of the year, we're going to start to see deals trending earlier and earlier because of the effect that Nigel mentioned, right? So the most attractive, you know, near commercial deals kind of get taken out, and then the ones that are closest to that, and then it kind of goes and down the food chain. So I think we're going to see that trend.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think just to add to that point, is that there's a lot of scarcity value. You know, there's not a lot of opportunities for de-risk commercial assets or late stage assets that can provide the growth that large pharma is looking for. And so they're going to have to move earlier to those assets that have novel targets or modalities that they believe have asymmetric upside. And so they're going to have to find ways to incorporate that within their portfolio and have to start taking those earlier stage bets.
Yeah, I would definitely say that discussions, you know, it's not that there's an abundance of these types of discussions going on, but there's a significant number. And then the question is how many actually close or you know, move towards a closing. So with that, maybe we'll quickly pivot. We could talk for hours with the skill set of this group. In terms of, let's switch now to investment into and building companies that have the potential to, you know, have an exit, whether it's through IPO or M&A, but you know, we'll focus on M&A. So from an institutional investment perspective, you know, any general thoughts on either areas you're investing in or participation on the board and how you add value to lead to, you know, to help management grow in a way that the company could be an attractive target? You know, is it very focused on a particular type of industry area, therapeutic, geographic, team member, patent portfolio? Like, I'm curious, sort of, and I know there's a million answers to this, but any general thoughts or trends or how to build a successful company that can exit?
I can start. I mean, this is obviously a really big topic. As you said, we could talk about this for a long time. I mean, I think in general, you know, we look to invest in rock star teams. If a company is too early to actually have a management team, we're typically investing in rock star academics or really early stage, you know, scientists and entrepreneurs that maybe we've worked with in the past. And I think in general, you know, we're looking to solve problems that have been intractable, but this company or this technology has a unique angle or approach that is going to allow you to circumvent that limitation. And we mainly focus on therapeutics. So it could be, you know, a totally novel target for a disease that no one has approached before. It could be a totally new category of therapies, like it was with CRISPR therapeutics or Blue Rock, for instance, with cell therapy. And I would say, you know, my first stint at Versant was in the 2011, 2012 timeframe. And at that point, there really was no IPO window. I mean, very few companies were going public. Now it's a bit better, but I would say the same thing was true then that is true now, is that every company we invest in has to have an M&A thesis. And we are constantly pressure testing that M&A thesis to even bring it earlier. What can we do to make that exit point potentially earlier? What value can we build as early as possible to make this company as valuable as possible or de-risked as possible in as short amount of time as we can, with an eye towards M&A. We're not talking about going public. We're talking about being acquired. And I think that mean, Nigel was in a meeting with me yesterday with our team where we were doing this, and it was a company that I'm going to invest in, and we were talking about how do we push the the M&A window for this company earlier and earlier, and I think that's a major focus for us.
Yeah, Versant's been very successful with these strategies, right? Like look at even Raise Bio, right? Picking a particular area, investment, 4 years and a bit to a $3 billion exit. That included an IPO along the way, right? Like that's an incredible time frame and build a value relative to what was invested in. So those strategies are great. Sorry, Nigel, I think you were going to say something or jump in.
No, I mean, Alicia's been doing this much longer than I, and she knows this, super well. What I was going to just add is to really emphasize that, things have changed a bit in the last few years. So I sold one of our portfolio companies to a farmer last year, and I'm based in the Basel office, and I sat down with the Basel team and said, so last time you sold a company, and they looked at me and said, we never sold a company to a farmer before. It's the first time we've done it. Every company that we'd exited had been through the public market. And it just blew me away. And I absolutely don't think we'll ever have that discussion again in the foreseeable future, that, the M&A exit will be much more the norm. And, going public, I think will be a more challenging exit route. And that goes to then, Alicia's comments about the kind of companies you build. And, if you're building for a public exit, you need a very different management team and a very different capability to what you would need if you're, going to sell in a couple of years to a pharma company. And so, really digging into that and having optionality. And the beautiful thing with Alicia's deal is she had like 10 different exit routes, and that's really great. That's what you want, is lots of optionality, because I think we're all a little bit cautious about betting on one route, and therefore building in as much optionality as possible. It makes it a lot easier to invest in that opportunity.
No, that's perfect. Siobhan, is there a business role, I'm not sure that's the word, but strategy within, let's say, big pharma or large biotech on almost build to acquire? Like you do an earlier stage commercial deal with a view of, integrating teams or, pushing along the technology to a point where it's very attractive and then can be, it's maybe an easier acquisition. As part of that structuring sometimes includes equity investments in the issuer. And then those funds sometimes are used to fund the programs and whatnot. And then that gives you a cornerstone investment to potentially lead to M&A. Is that a strategy often or occasionally?
Yeah, well,
implemented?
I guess yes and no. A couple of things. I think, build to buys are, I think, inherently really difficult. Not impossible, but in general, I would say you really need an R&D champion internally, really on the research side, right, who is really excited about the company, about the science, about the team, to Alicia's point. And, that's certainly a route you can take then. So, but we tend to use that less just because I think pharma and large biotech in general tends to react better to programs and assets. So moving things a little bit further along is much preferred rather than building to buy. Now, again, there's always exceptions, but just in general, I find at least my teams have tended to react a lot better once they have something tangible in hand. And then there's sort of there's other ways to think about that, whether it's, licensing or, an acquisition at the time rather than that build to buy structure. Just in terms of equity, we like to use our balance sheet a lot. And what you'll find is that for a lot of our collaborations in general, we will tend to take an equity investment because we want to think more about sharing in the upside if we're successful about our programs. Now, it has the nice complementary effect that it does set us up later with a position in the company if we want to think about M&A. And of course, it almost guarantees us for certain that we'll get a call if something is going on with the company. So to me, it is a nice tool and a lever that we can pull as we're trying to think about, you know, both short and long-term prospects for the companies we're supporting and are interested in.
Okay, great. Any other perspectives on?
I think Steve has got his hand
sorry.
up,
Oh,
actually.
sorry, I looked down, Steve. Go ahead, please.
Joe's skills as a Zoom moderator are growing. One thing that I would caution folks about is that I think Nigel's interaction with his Basel team is indicative of a changing mindset in the biotech marketplace. That a lot of people, when they put together their companies with stars in their eyes about what they're going to do, a lot of them had that public exit in mind when they first started out with their team to build the company. And you know, as you listen to this panel talking about how these companies come about, where they license in products from pharmas who've acquired a business but have, you know, that 30% of assets they don't particularly want to do, but they want to keep some sort of back-end participation, so they'll license it out to somebody else to develop. All of those structures that are put in place at the beginning of your company that then become the foundation of your company that you build from can have some real traps in them for M&A, because those back-end rights, you know, those when somebody licenses out a product to allow you to develop it, there's going to be some clauses back there around Section 20 that say, and oh, by the way, if there's ever a change of control, these are the things that are going to occur, and you're going to have to get our consent to do X, Y, and Z. And oh, by the way, we didn't ever contemplate that you would be allowed to use this technology if you get bought by some people on the prohibited list because there are big competitors. We don't want to see them with our product. There's all sorts of stuff that could be landmines for the unwary when you're putting together a company. If you have in your mind a public exit and then you pivot to an M&A exit, you really do have to go back and look at your documents and make sure that you haven't caused yourself some harm because you gave away something back then when you just didn't understand how important it was, or you just didn't have the bargaining power to get rid of it. And so as M&A becomes more and more and more important in the biotech world, people who are looking at companies as potential acquisitions targets, you can't start early enough at looking at what those landmines might be, what consent rights might be acquired, what anti-competitive clauses are in those documents, and start figuring out before things are moving quickly towards close, what you can do to get rid of them. Because of course, if you wait to the last minute to get rid of them, you're giving leverage to the other side in the negotiation.
Steve, just to add to that, because I think it's such a great point, I think platform companies need to be especially cautious in this regard, because many times I've seen a couple of cases now where platform companies have given away licenses around a certain target, but they haven't had the associated change of control provisions where these fall away for the acquirer, or at least there's ways for the acquirer to pursue that target independently. And that can become a real hurdle if you end up with a conflicting program that is strategically important to the acquirer. So I think it's a great point and would highlight it, especially with respect to platform companies.
That's
I mean,
great.
another thing that in that regard that's worth mentioning is, you know, if you have a platform company where you're, you know, kind of forming collaborations with a lot of other companies, you know, most pharma companies don't want to take over other people's collaborations. So, you know, if you want to be bought by a pharma company, if you've got, you know, 5 collaborations with competitors, that's not going to be attractive to the pharma company, because they don't want to then be on the hook for supplying services to competitor companies.
And I guess I was just going to add to this conversation in that it's always difficult to predict if and when an M&A transaction would occur or will occur, so that a company who's evaluating all the options to them, and they need to ensure that they have the capital available to them to fund themselves through their next inflection points, and really have the conviction in building out their own story in the future, because a transaction may occur in the next couple of years, it may occur in 5 years. There's numerous examples of companies that people had put on the top targets for 2024 list that were on that list in 2020, and they're still public companies, they're still moving forward. So it's difficult to predict when that occurs, and you just need to be able to, you know, evaluate your status quo standalone plan first.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, you know, not only do you want to make sure you have capital because you don't know when an M&A is going to happen, you want to make sure you have all your contract ducks in a row. You want to make sure that your IP is on free and clear, that, you know, that when the company was started and it was just a couple folks in an accelerator, that people got all of the invention assignment agreement signed. And I'm talking about this from real lived experience, having to scramble and get those things, or find out that the IP was not free and clear, and having to go do cleanup licenses when you have to basically act like you have leverage when you really don't. So I would make sure that those things are professionalized, you know, as soon as possible, so that you're ready to put together a legitimate data room to do a deal.
Yeah, a lot of folks when they start off their companies, they you know, they're resource constrained, and so they can't spend the money on the professionals necessary in order to get all of their ducks in a row. And then as you know, the series of challenges emerge for the company, they forget about the fact that they made some choices 2 years ago that are going to come back and haunt them. And so going back and looking and asking yourself, what did we just sort of gloss over back then? What is it we should be concentrating on now that we've cashed up a bit and have some resources to clean some stuff up?
Yeah, and that's the value oftentimes that institutional investment can bring to a company, right? That extensive experience to the extent that the team doesn't have it on, you know, at the Series A or prior as part of the diligence, the cleanup and everything starts off on a good footing at the time of a significant investment. We'll pivot quickly to the perspective of the acquirer for a moment, and then before we turn to the M&A transactions themselves and working with advisors. So from an acquirer perspective, what are some of the key metrics or things that are important when you're going in and evaluating a company? Like, there are all kinds of deal risks, there's integration risk, there's a number of different factors that are considered. Are there any driving words of wisdom that you would offer up to issuers in terms of getting ready for that experience and what's important to an acquirer?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can, you know, talk about making the switch from, you know, the pharma side to the venture side. And, you know, I worked for probably 30 years, you know, doing deals on the pharma side. And, you know, you live and breathe NPV. You know, at the end of the day, it's all about the business model. And Sean can attest to this, I'm 100% sure. Ultimately, you've got to get in front of your board and you've got to have an NPV valuation of the opportunity that's going to justify the deal. Now, you know, moving into the venture side, you know, I kind of feel most people have never done an NPV calculation. And so, you know, it was quite interesting to me how it's all about cap table, and everybody talks cap tables and nobody in pharma talks about cap tables. Everybody in pharma are only interested in NPV calculations of the value. So if you're looking at running that process, and this is probably where you get into advisors and so on, and Sean, I'm sure, can give a lot of interesting input here, but the key thing is you want to make it easy for that deal team to come up with a large NPV valuation of your asset. And, you know, that's a, you know, it's a balance of, you know, you've got to have a credible, aggressive story, you know, and so it's not this kind of, you know, the last obesity drug was predicted to be $25 billion. So my obesity drug's going to be $25 billion. It's got to be much more rigorous than that. But to the extent that you can give to the BD team a well-constructed, you know, supportable, defendable business case that's going to support an NPV valuation, then it will help them to make that case to their management, and it will give you an ability to defend, you know, that valuation mark. But I think most startup companies have very little understanding of, you know, how to generate that business value case. And it's quite a lot of work. You know, it's not something you can just do, you know, the week before you get into an M&A discussion.
Interesting. Anyone else?
Oh,
Sure.
Sean, go ahead, please.
Sean should.
No, I was
Definitely.
just gonna, to Nigel's great point there, I think also the NPV analysis for earlier stage companies are important to rein in expectations. I think a lot of companies move forward and understand the value of their programs and how it may fit within the landscape. However, it's important to do that rigorous analysis to ensure that there's a
Got to be
credible,
credible. Yeah.
and not only looking at the value of your drug, but how it fits within the market. What is the competition in the market today, but what's coming behind you, to really understand what the value opportunity is. And that, I think, is important to set expectations for your board, for the management team, as well as being able to be credible with a potential acquirer as you talk about your opportunity.
One
Just
question.
to add to that, because I think it's important everyone should really consider differentiation as they're building their company. So I think it goes hand in hand with what Sean said about, what's ahead of you, but also looking behind what's coming up next, right? To make sure that you have a defensible position. And then I think the other thing that we see that sometimes is really disappointing, and it's strategic, but it's not necessarily the best strategy for building value. We see a lot of times companies are really afraid to do those killer experiments. So if you can early on have conviction in terms of your science and really put it to the test, you're going to find that you can very quickly build value when, otherwise, you're in a situation where, as Nigel mentioned, the business team kind of doesn't know where to go with this, and you just can't justify the upside relative to the risk because there is so much uncertainty still. So just a small piece of advice for folks to consider.
Okay, thanks. So Steve and I have had some experience over an extended period where large pharma or biotech in the context, like public M&A context, would prefer to take an asset versus buy the whole company. Have you seen that as either a trend, or is it tax driven or whatnot? Because the conventional approach is you take the company and divest what you don't want, because it's arguably easier to structure and tax wise explain and all of that. Any views on, is it just a couple of deals we happened across, or is there a consideration there on an asset versus by the company approach by acquirers?
I think we're going to see more of those deals. I mean, Siobhan should comment, but Siobhan, you already brought up the Sanofi and Hibrix deal. I think that was a really creative deal structure, and as far as I understand it, they were able to do some things really creatively on the tax side, with the new entity without the lead asset going public again. That they were able to avoid a lot of taxes that way, and then I think it also allows Inhibrix and their investors to have multiple bites at the apple beyond just that first exit. And I think there's a couple of other examples of those. So I think that those types of deals can be really, really valuable for everyone. I think they just take a long time to get done.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd love to do asset acquisitions more. It's it's like the holy grail, but you're right. I mean, Joe, for me too, my experience is very consistent with yours, that more often than not, we end up with double taxation or other issues that are preventing us from, going ahead and just acquiring the asset. So we've really been thinking more about, acquiring and then divesting or spinning out. But it's interesting because, as you think about spin outs too, you can think about equity in the new co and giving yourself a little bit more upside, diversifying your R&D by putting another company to work where you have the equity. So I think there's lots of levers there we can pull, that, allow us, I guess, to accept the longer haul process of, acquiring and then divesting or spinning out.
I mean,
Okay,
I guess it's important to distinguish between, buying an asset and an asset deal versus a share deal. which are two, somewhat different things. And I think if you are thinking about, maybe the right way to generate value is to sell an asset, you might want to think about, putting that asset early on into a separate legal entity so that you can do a share deal and sell the asset. Again, it goes a bit to this kind of optionality and thinking upfront about what you might want to achieve and how to tax optimize that.
Yeah.
But, obviously for the shareholders, the asset deal is, very rarely attractive. I mean,
Exactly.
we are going to want a share deal.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that, you can't construct a share deal around an asset.
Yeah, I completely agree, Nigel, although companies do need to be quite careful about over structuring and over planning their affairs in the hopes that something may happen someday, because there are generally tax efficient strategies to push an asset down into a sub at an appropriate time. But a company that creates 10 subs with 10 assets and trying to manage and organize that is,
I mean, it depends on your tax jurisdiction. I mean, that's the other thing, sitting in Europe, the rules on this are quite country specific, so you do need to think about where you are.
Absolutely. And I was speaking more from a Canadian perspective. So with that, we're going to pivot quickly to the transaction itself and working with advisors, and whether that's legal or financial, some of the risks of getting a deal done, approaches, how that works, right? We've already talked a little bit about bridging value gaps, but does anyone want to kick off on maybe Steve? Like, I'm getting better here. Steve, cross-border M&A.
Well, actually, I want to pick up on something Nigel was just referring to as tax jurisdictions. As you're contemplating doing a transaction, it is important to get a good arm around what exactly your set of factors are that are going to affect your deal. Joe and I worked on a deal recently that had a significant Israeli subsidiary in it, and the tax jurisdiction of Israel coming up, which of course it's a very strong biotech nation, and so they show up in a lot of transactions. The problem you have is that the capital gains tax applies to foreign owners of shares in companies that develop their value from assets that are located in Israel. And so you have to, when you're thinking about a transaction, you need to address those kinds of issues that are very deal specific. But in that case, it's hard to find deals that don't have some sort of issue. This one in particular is problematic because it has the North American buyer, that European buyer, a seller of the company is going to have to pay capital gains tax in Israel unless they get an exemption, and they actually have to file a piece of paper to get it. And organizing all of that turned into just this mountainous task of having to get paying agents and having to get local taxation authorities and having to do exemptive relief applications and all of this stuff. And if we hadn't addressed that early and gotten the proper advisors up front early, it could have destroyed the deal at the back end, because it has a substantial, it was a 3-month play of various efforts to get it complete. And so getting your advisors up front and sort of getting your arms wrapped around what your particular issues are and what your long lead items are is, I think, incredibly important when you're trying to have a successful deal. You gotta have some upfront thought about who you're going to need advice from and get that advice early so that you can properly address the issues.
Yeah, typically,
conversely, you could just be in Switzerland where there's no capital gains tax, which is great.
We had a Swiss parent over the Israeli sub. It did us no good.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no,
we tried.
That didn't help for that. Yeah, we often see that. Look, the tax tail wags the dog, right? Like last year, we did a very complex M&A deal where it had the Netherlands, Cayman Islands, US, and Canada. And like every lever you pushed here tipped something else over in another jurisdiction, right? It became a very complex exercise to accomplish what they wanted to. Ultimately, it closed, but it took a lot of advisors, a lot of time and effort to think through the issues. But with that, Steve, you want to chat maybe a little bit about cross-border M&A, maybe how Canadian companies typically do this with plans of arrangement, a few factors to think about?
Yeah, if you are, this is a Canadian audience, so the One of the things you have to keep in mind to gain tax, there is no rollover between a American. If someone's going to give you equity in an American vehicle in exchange for your equity in a Canadian vehicle, there's no rollover under the Canada-U.S. tax treaty available. And so that becomes an immediate taxable event for the selling Canadian holder of their shares who's going to receive shares back. A lot of people think that share-for-share transaction is just in that bucket in their head that it's not a taxable event, but that's just not the case when you're crossing the Canada-U.S. border. And a lot of tax treaties have that exact same problem in it, because you can understand from a country's perspective why they wouldn't want to have rollover treatment in their cross-border tax treaty, because that means the tax, when it's ultimately payable, is going to be paid in the second country. And so they're going to want to make sure that they preserve their tax base by not allowing that kind of tax leakage. So how do you put that in place? There's a mechanism in Canada that we've invented called an exchangeable share structure, which allows you to basically to defer that taxable event until you actually want to exit and you have an opportunity to exit from that second vehicle. So if you have a share-for-share transaction that's crossing a border, there's mechanisms you can put in place to make that happen. And that's just one example of sort of the complexities that can come about when you start designing M&A transactions. And that's one of the reasons why it's over 90% public deals now, it may be even over 95%, proceed by way of plan of arrangement in Canada. A plan of arrangement is it's Canada's equivalent to a merger transaction in the US, and that's a shareholder approved transaction. You go and get a vote of your shareholders to approve it. But in Canada, we also have the added gloss that you have to go to court and get a court order to approve it as well. And the court is going to be looking at whether or not the transaction is fundamentally fair to the participants in it. But the nice thing about the fact that you're getting a court order is that the corporate statutes in Canada give the court very broad authority to make an order at closing that will accomplish basically whatever you need to in order to make your transaction work. And so you are only constrained by your imagination when it comes to putting together the transaction that ultimately results in exactly what you want, because you can just, with the fairness dealt with and with the approval of your shareholders, you can go to the court and say, I want the following things to occur. I want them to occur in this sequence. I want these 6 things to happen on this day. The next day, I want these 4 things to occur. An amalgamation on this day to trigger a tax year end. The world is your oyster when you're developing a sequence of events that can occur at your closing, because you can just get the court to give you the order. And so it's an incredibly flexible and incredibly useful tool. And as a result, given its use and its flexibility, it's the way the vast majority of Canadian deals on the public side work. On the private side, obviously, it's less useful because you can get your arms wrapped around all of the shareholders typically. And of course, then if you have unanimous shareholders, you can get them to approve whatever changes to the corporate structure you need. In a plan of arrangement, you only need 2/3 of the people who show up and vote at the meeting to make whatever changes you want. And so you aren't constrained by that elusive shareholder who's decided this is the opportune moment to take their lifetime trip to Antarctica and have been out of range for 2 weeks and are causing you to go bald.
Or hold you ransom for a signature. So ultimately, the court-approved process is very efficient. It's been done thousands of times, I'm sure, in Canada. So it's a well-trodden path, and you can structure very creatively into that to get things done. So that's great, Steve. Hey, Sean, in terms of working with financial advisors coming into, and sorry, why I always jump, Steve, we're running a bit short of time here. So Sean, what do you think in terms of companies working with financial advisors, arguably, start working with or develop relationships early on so it's not a fire drill at the last moment, not dissimilar to working with sophisticated lawyers who have done lots of structuring. You can efficiently get to, the end line, the goal line, but presumably, calling you on the day there's an approach to the chair of the board or the CEO could create some timing related delay as you do your work, among other things.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd say is that preparation is key, and that having discussions with advisors well in advance of a potential transaction is important. You want to get all of the work done on a clear day before an offer comes in and things become fast and furious, we typically work with companies as they think about building out their models early on, as they think about beginning at an earlier stage dialogue with a broader landscape of strategics, such that if an offer does come in from one, they have connectivity with others that they can call. The ways to maximize, what we would do in an M&A transaction is we're looking to optimize value for a company, and the best way to do that is through competition and having a number of counterparties, interested in an asset, putting in bids that allows you to have flexibility in terms of what you can message from a competition standpoint and really drive, further value for shareholders. I'd say that we've seen that a lot, and Siobhan mentioned that at the start, is that, over the last year, there's been a lot more competition for these assets that has really driven up these prices. Someone mentioned Raise Bio before, 3 bidders, to the very end of that deal, which led increasing bids all along the way that drove that $4.1 billion value that they were able to achieve, just a few months after the IPO. So I'd say that it's important to have dialogue with advisors early. It's important to begin dialogue with potential strategics early so that they are aware of you and they are aware of the story, and they're not picking up from nowhere if something does come in, and that they have familiarity with the asset.
That's great. And from earlier comments from Alicia and Nigel, like having that strategy from day one, or at least very early on a potential M&A exit, and the things you need to think about and be forward planning, I think is key. And Siobhan as well, like from the, developing relationships and making sure that large biotech or pharma know the market and know who they may be interested, so that as milestones are achieved, you're able to take advantage of opportunities at the right time and not miss them because someone else pounced, on something that your particular company would have wanted. Any final thoughts on this topic, maybe before we then turn over to final remarks from Wendy?
The only thing I was going to add there, Joe, is I just absolutely love working with our financial advisors, and we work with a range of them at Gilead. And, I would just urge people to really stay humble and keep an open mind and listen closely to your financial advisors, because, we might see things that are in this bucket. They're really seeing things that are, have a much bigger aperture. And, listening to their guidance and expertise, I think, is vital as you're building the company. I've just found them to be tremendously valuable, either whether they're on our side or the other side. And quite frankly, they can be paramount to in bridging gaps and be extremely helpful in negotiations, which may not be something that's very obvious to folks.
Okay, I think we're almost at the time. With that, thank you very much to everyone who participated today. It was incredible. So thank you very much. And with that, Wendy, we'll turn over to you for final remarks.
Thanks very much, Joe. And thank you, everybody, for sharing your amazing insights, thoughts, trends, advice. It was really fantastic. Sorry, my computer just went dark. It was really fantastic. And I think everyone got a lot out of it. You could certainly see that through the questions and the chat. So Alicia, Sean, Stevens, Siobhan, Nigel, amazing. Nigel, thanks for sticking with us. I don't know what time it is where you are, but I've been watching the sun go down behind you, so really appreciate it. And Joe, excellent moderating. I'd also like to thank Joe for your leadership in pulling this together, and Blake's generally for the support of the ongoing breakfast series, whether it's virtual or in person. Big thanks to the LSBC team, Ryan, Claire, and Nadia on the events team, and then our marketing team, Rosabelle and Lily, who you somewhat met earlier. We usually share our upcoming events, but I think in the interest of time, I won't go through them. We'll just flash them up. Most of them are in person in Vancouver, with the exception of our showcase series in Victoria that we do annually. So hope to see many of you there. And with that, I'll close this off because I'm conscious of the time. And thank you all for joining us. And again, thanks very much to our amazing speakers.
Thank you.
Good day.
Bye, everyone.